Imagine a world where your entire existence is reduced to a single 6-inch movement. You do not speak, you do not look up, you do not think. If you blink at the wrong time, you lose a finger. If you slow down, you lose your bread. For 12 hours a day, 300 days a year, you are not a human being. You are a biological gear in a machine that never sleeps. This is the story of the Great Monotony, a period in history where millions of souls were swallowed by the most repetitive work ever devised by man. This isn't just history, it's a psychological horror story of how we traded our humanity for the tick of a clock. The year is 1840. The air in Manchester, England is a thick, oily soup of coal smoke and human sweat. Inside the textile mills, the noise is the first thing that breaks you. It's not just loud, it's a physical force, a rhythmic thumping that vibrates through your teeth and settles in your marrow. This is the power loom, and it is the new god of the working class. In the pre-industrial world, a weaver was an artist. They saw a blanket from the first thread to the final fold. But the Industrial Revolution killed the artist and birthed the operator. For the first time in human history, work was no longer dictated by the rising sun or the changing seasons. It was dictated by the steam engine. The machine does not get tired, so you are no longer allowed to be tired. Meet Elias. He's 10 years old, though he looks 40. His job is the piecer. As the massive spinning frames move back and forth, threads inevitably snap. Elias's entire life consists of one motion, leaning over a moving carriage and twisting two ends of broken thread together with his thumb and forefinger. He does this every 5 seconds. If he is too slow, the machine smashes into him. If he is too fast, he wastes movement and burns calories he doesn't have. This is the birth of repetitive labor on a global scale. Before this, humans did many things poorly. Now they were required to do one thing perfectly, thousands of times a day. Psychologists today call it cognitive tunneling, but in 1840, they just called it the grind. The repetition starts to change the brain. The workers describe a state of waking sleep where the world outside the mill ceases to exist. There is only the thread. There is only the snap. There is only the knot. By midday, the repetition turns into a trance. The workers' hands move independently of their minds. It is a terrifying efficiency. They have become the first generation of humans to be clocked in, their lives measured not by the beauty of what they make, but by the sheer, agonizing volume of their repetition. But as the 19th century bleeds into the 20th, this monotony isn't going away. It's evolving. It's moving from the damp floors of England to the gleaming, terrifyingly fast assembly lines of Detroit, where the repetition will move from a struggle for survival to a psychological war. By the dawn of the 20th century, the soul-crushing repetition of the textile mills had crossed the Atlantic, finding a new, more clinical home in the United States. If the 1800s were about the power of steam, the 1900s were about the power of the second hand. This was the era of scientific management, a cold, calculated philosophy spearheaded by a man named Frederick Winslow Taylor. He didn't see workers as people. He saw them as complex machines that needed to be calibrated. In the mid-1910s, the world of labor changed forever in a small corner of Highland Park, Michigan. Henry Ford had a vision, but it wasn't just about a car. It was about the total annihilation of wasted motion. Before the assembly line, a group of skilled mechanics would walk around a car, building it from the ground up. It was slow, varied, and human. Ford realized that if you kept the man stationary and moved the car instead, you could squeeze more work out of a single human body than ever thought possible. Entered the $5-day worker. On the surface, it sounded like a dream, double the average wage, but the price was the utter surrender of the mind. On Ford's assembly line, a worker was assigned a single bolt. Not a wheel, not an engine, just one bolt. The chassis would slide in front of him on a conveyor belt.
He had exactly 12 seconds to tighten that bolt. Then the car moved. The next car arrived. 12 seconds. Tighten. Move. 12 seconds. Tighten. Move. This was repetition refined into a science. To ensure maximum efficiency, time and motion auditors would stand over workers with stopwatches and clipboards. They would measure the angle of a man's elbow, the flick of his wrist, and the number of steps he took. If a worker could shave half a second off his task by moving his left foot 2 inches to the right, that movement became the new law. This was the gospel of the stopwatch. The psychological toll was unlike anything seen in human history. In the textile mills, you were fighting the machine. In the Ford factory, you were becoming the machine. Workers began to suffer from a strange new ailment, the Fordization of the brain. Men would go home and find their hands twitching in their sleep, miming the motion of the wrench. They couldn't hold a conversation with their wives because their minds were stuck in a 12-second loop. The repetition was so intense that Ford had to hire thousands of extra workers just to cover those who would simply drop their tools in the middle of a shift and walk out, driven half mad by the monotony. They were paid $5 a day to stop being human. It was the first time in history that speed up, the deliberate acceleration of the conveyor belt, was used as a tool of management. If the boss wanted more profit, he simply turned a dial, and the human gears had to spin faster. The work was no longer about skill, it was about endurance. It was a race against a motor that never got tired, in a factory where the only thing cheaper than the steel was the spirit of the man standing in front of it. But even this level of repetition was child's play compared to what was coming, because while Ford was mastering the assembly of metal, the world was about to discover a way to apply this same crushing boredom to the very fabric of information itself.
As the gears of the heavy industrial age began to grind into the mid-20th century, a new kind of monotony emerged. People thought that by moving from the grease-stained floors of the factory to the fluorescent-lit halls of the office, they were escaping the human gear lifestyle. They were wrong. The repetition didn't disappear, it just changed its clothes. It traded the denim jumpsuit for a white shirt and a thin black tie. This was the birth of the information assembly line. Before the digital revolution, there was a massive, invisible army of workers known as data entry clerks and key punch operators. Their job was to translate the messiness of human life, names, addresses, tax records, birth certificates, into a language that the early primitive computers could understand. Imagine a room the size of a football field, filled with rows upon rows of metal desks. There is no music, there is no talking. The only sound is the frantic, percussive clack, clack, clack of thousands of fingers hitting keys. A worker would sit in front of a machine with a stack of paper forms 3 feet high. Their task? Read a number, punch a hole in a card. Read a number, punch a hole. If they made a single mistake, the entire card was ruined. If they looked away for a second, they lost their place in the sea of digits. In the Ford factories, the repetition was physical. Here, it was ocular and mental. The key punch girl, as they were often patronizingly called, would process up to 10,000 keystrokes an hour. Her eyes would dart from the paper to the machine, back and forth, thousands of days a day, until the muscles in her neck locked into a permanent cramp. This was the paperwork purgatory. It was a job that required the precision of a surgeon, but provided the stimulation of a brick wall. By the 1960s, psychologists began to notice a terrifying trend. These workers were experiencing mental atrophy. When you perform a task that is too simple to be engaging, but too demanding to allow your mind to wander, the brain begins to shut down non-essential functions. These workers would leave their shifts feeling like ghosts.
They would stare at the grocery store shelves, unable to choose a loaf of bread because their decision-making centers had been turned off for 8 hours straight. This era proved that repetition wasn't just about moving heavy steel. It was about the processing of nothingness. It was the commodification of the human gaze. The corporation didn't want your ideas, your creativity, or your personality. It wanted your eyes and your fingertips to act as a bridge between a piece of paper and a silicon chip. We had built machines to think for us, but in the process, we forced millions of humans to think like machines. But as the 21st century approached, the walls of the office began to crumble. The repetition didn't end, it escaped. It followed us home, into our pockets, and into a new global gig economy where the work became so repetitive it started to feel like a glitch in the matrix.
We like to think that the age of the human gear ended with the rise of artificial intelligence. We tell ourselves that the machines are finally doing the boring stuff so we can be creative. But look closer at the screen you're holding. Behind the curtain of every smart algorithm is a hidden global underclass performing the most repetitive labor in the history of our species. Welcome to the era of the digital sweatshop. In the 1800s, you could see the smoke from the factory. Today, the factory is invisible. It's spread across living rooms in the Philippines, crowded cafes in Kenya, and cramped apartments in Ohio. Millions of people are currently logged into platforms where they perform micro-tasks. These are jobs so small they shouldn't even exist, yet they're the only thing keeping the modern world from collapsing into digital chaos. The task is simple, yet soul-crushing: image labeling. For 8 to 10 hours a day, a worker sits in front of a monitor. An image flashes on the screen. It's a blurry photo of a street corner. The worker must click and drag a box around every traffic light. Click, drag, submit. Next image. Click, drag, submit. They do this thousands of times a day, teaching a self-driving car how to see. The car gets smarter, the human gets hollowed out. This is the ultimate evolution of the assembly line. In Ford's factory, you at least moved your body. In the digital sweatshop, you only move a pixel. The pay is often measured in pennies per click. There is no union, no health benefits, and no break room. If you pause to stretch your back, the algorithm notices your drop in throughput and may kick you off the platform entirely. You are competing against a global pool of desperate labor in a race to the bottom of the wage scale. But the repetition takes a darker turn when it comes to content moderation. Imagine your entire job is to watch 10-second clips of the worst things humanity has to offer: violence, hate, and cruelty, and click a delete button over and over. 10 seconds of horror. Click. 10 seconds of horror. Click. The brain wasn't designed to process trauma at this frequency. It's a repetitive motion of the psyche. These workers aren't just bored. They are being systematically desensitized, their empathy worn down like the teeth of a rusted gear. The irony is staggering. We are using humans to act as the manual override for AI. Every time you solve a CAPTCHA to prove you aren't a robot, you are performing a tiny, unpaid microtask for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. We have reached a point where the work is so repetitive that we can't even tell where the human ends and the software begins. In the 19th century, we chained bodies to machines. In the 21st, we have chained the human mind to the data stream. We have created a world where the most advanced technology on Earth relies on the most primitive, repetitive labor ever conceived. The great monotony didn't die. It just went digital. What happens to a species designed for hunting, gathering, and complex social bonding when it is forced into a loop of infinite repetition? We are currently living through the greatest psychological experiment in history. For nearly 200 years, we have pushed the boundaries of human endurance, not by testing how much weight we can carry, but by testing how little stimulation we can survive. The result is a phenomenon scientists call the erosion of the self. When you perform a repetitive task for long enough, the brain's prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for complex decision-making and personality, effectively goes into a low-power mode. You become a functional zombie. Chronic repetition leads to a specific type of burnout that isn't characterized by stress, but by a profound sense of anomie or rootlessness. Workers in these repetitive cycles often report feeling as though they are watching their lives happen from behind a glass wall. They are physically present, but their consciousness has retreated to survive the boredom. The physical toll is just as devastating. From the weaver's thumb of the 1840s to the carpal tunnel syndrome of the 1990s, and now the tech neck and digital eye strain of the modern click worker, our bodies are literally warping to fit the tasks we give them. We are evolving in reverse, not to become more capable, but to become more specialized for a single, meaningless motion. Evolution spent millions of years perfecting the human hand for tool-making and art. We have spent 2 centuries using it to pull a lever or tap a glass screen. But the most chilling aspect of the most repetitive work in history is its invisibility. In the past, the factory whistle told the community when the monotony started and ended. Today, because of the gig economy and the always-on nature of digital work, the repetition has bled into our leisure time. We scroll through social media using the exact same thumb motion used by the data labelers in the digital sweatshops. We have integrated the mechanics of repetitive labor into our very relaxation. The loop has become total. Is there a way out? History suggests that whenever humanity reaches a breaking point of monotony, a revolution follows. In the early 20th century, it was the rise of labor unions and the demand for the 8-hour workday, a fight for the right to be human outside of the factory walls. Today, the conversation is shifting toward universal basic income and the total automation of repetitive tasks. However, we face a new dilemma. If we give all the repetitive work to the robots, what happens to the billions of people whose livelihoods depend on being human gears? As we stand on the edge of the AI era, we are forced to ask a terrifying question. Have we become so used to the repetition that we've forgotten how to do anything else? The story of the most repetitive work in history is not just a chronicle of labor, it is a warning. It shows us that while we can build machines to do almost anything, the one thing we cannot do is turn a human being into a machine without breaking their spirit. The loop is tightening, but the ending of the story hasn't been written yet. It will be decided by whether we choose to reclaim our time or whether we continue to click, drag, and submit until there is nothing left of us but the motion.
As we look toward the horizon, we find ourselves at a strange crossroads. For 2 centuries, the goal was to make humans act more like machines to increase production. Now the goal is to make machines act more like humans so we can finally stop. But there's a hidden cost to this transition that no one is talking about, the human residual. Even as AI takes over the clicking and the bolt tightening, the shadow of repetition is lengthening, creating a world where we are no longer the workers, but the subjects of the repetition. Think about the modern consumer loop. In the past, you were paid to repeat a motion. Today, you are manipulated into repeating a behavior. The same psychological triggers used to keep a worker on the assembly line are now used to keep you scrolling through a feed. The swipe down to refresh is the digital equivalent of pulling the lever on a steam press. It is a repetitive, low-thought action designed to trigger a dopamine hit. We haven't escaped the factory. The factory has simply moved inside our minds. In the near future, we face the automation paradox. As robots take over the repetitive physical and digital tasks, the remaining human jobs become hyper-specialized and even more repetitive in their own way.
We see this in prompt engineering or model tuning, where humans must talk to AI in a repetitive, coded language for hours on end to get a single result. We are becoming the trainers of our own replacements. The work has shifted from doing the task to watching the machine do the task and clicking accept or reject. It is a new kind of boredom, the boredom of the observer. But history shows us that the human spirit is not a flat line, it's a coiled spring. The more you compress it with monotony, the more violently it eventually snaps back. We are seeing the first signs of the great refusal. Around the world, there is a growing movement of people walking away from high-efficiency, high-repetition lives. They are returning to slow crafts, pottery, gardening, woodworking, things where the repetition is not a burden, but a rhythm chosen by the soul. This is the ultimate lesson of the great monotony. Repetition without purpose is a prison, but repetition with mastery is an art. The weaver of 1700 was happy because every throw of the shuttle was a choice. The weaver of 1840 was miserable because every throw was a command. As we move into an age where AI can do the command work, we have a terrifying and beautiful opportunity to reclaim our rhythm. The cycle of the human gear is finally reaching its breaking point. We are the first generation in 200 years that has the chance to look at the clock and say, no. The machines are ready to take the load. The question is, once the clicking stops and the assembly line goes silent, do we still remember who we are? Or have we been parts of the machine for so long that we've forgotten how to be the engineer? The story of the most repetitive work in history ends here, at your fingertips. The loop is open. What you do next, whether you click the next link out of habit or look up and breathe, is the first step toward a different kind of history.
The machines eventually stop, but the human mind does not. One of the most haunting realizations in the history of labor is that the damage of repetitive work isn't just felt by the individual, it is etched into the very map of our geography and our DNA. Recent studies have uncovered a chilling phenomenon, the psychological imprint of industrialization. In regions of the United States and the United Kingdom that were once the heartlands of coal and heavy manufacturing, people today, generations after the factories closed, still show significantly higher levels of anxiety, lower life satisfaction, and a measurable decrease in conscientiousness. This is the legacy of the intergenerational loop. When a person's life is reduced to a single motion for decades, that experience alters their worldview, their parenting, and the values they pass down. The scientific management of the 1920s didn't just build cars, it built a specific kind of human temperament. It favored obedience over initiative and endurance over creativity. Today, the grandchildren of those workers are still fighting a silent battle against a psychological adversity that was baked into their communities over a century ago. Even in the pre-industrial world, repetition existed, but it was anchored to the rhythms of nature. A Roman farmer might plant seeds for hours, or an Egyptian builder might chip at a stone for days, but their work had a feedback loop. They saw the grain grow. They saw the pyramid rise. In contrast, the modern repetitive task is disconnected. The data entry clerk never sees the person whose life they are digitizing. The assembly line worker never meets the family driving the car. This disconnection creates a unique mental rot known as anomic boredom, a state where the worker feels like a ghost in their own life, performing actions that have no visible end and no human meaning. We are currently standing at the edge of the ultimate repetition, the AI mirror. As we use millions of low-paid click workers to train artificial intelligence, we are essentially teaching machines to mimic our most robotic behaviors. We are refining our own obsolescence through the very monotony that has defined the last 200 years.
If the 19th century was about the death of the artist and the 20th was about the death of the individual, the 21st century is threatening the death of the human presence. But there is a final twist. As repetition becomes the exclusive domain of silicon and steel, humanity is experiencing a great awakening. There's a reason why handcrafted, artisanal, and human-made have become the most expensive labels in the world. We are finally beginning to put a premium on the one thing a machine can never do: make a mistake with soul. The history of the most repetitive work is finally coming to a close, not because the work disappeared, but because we are finally realizing that our value lies in everything the machine cannot repeat. The gear is slowing down. The stopwatch has been dropped. For the first time since the first steam engine hissed to life in a Manchester mill, the question is no longer, how fast can you repeat this, but what will you do now that you don't have to?
As we reach the final act of this historic monotony, we have to look at the dark heart of the modern world, the fulfillment center. We often think of the assembly line as a relic of the past, but in the 2020s, it evolved into something far more pervasive and punishing. If Henry Ford managed the movement of parts, the modern optimization algorithm manages the movement of human breath. This is the era of the algorithm as boss. In massive warehouses that stretch for miles across the American Midwest and the plains of Europe, hundreds of thousands of workers perform the stow and pick. Their entire reality is a handheld scanner. The screen tells them exactly which aisle to walk to, which bin to reach into, and how many seconds they have to do it. There is no supervisor shouting orders. There is only a silent countdown on a plastic screen. If the worker falls behind by 5 seconds, the system flags them. If they do it 3 times, they are automatically terminated. This is the most repetitive physical work in human history because it is the first time human movement has been perfectly synced with global demand. Every time someone, somewhere clicks Buy Now, a human being miles away begins a repetitive sprint. They reach, they grab, they scan, they bin, over and over, up to 300 items an hour for 10 hours a day. It is a marathon that never ends, performed in a windowless box. The physical consequences are a return to the 19th century. Doctors are seeing repetitive strain injuries that shouldn't exist in a high-tech society. But the psychological consequence is what historians call the de-skilling of humanity. In this environment, your brain is actually a liability. If you think, you slow down. If you wonder where the package is going, you lose your rhythm. The goal of the system is to turn the human body into a biological cursor, a tool that simply moves a physical object from point A to point B because a robotic arm isn't quite dexterous enough to do it yet. We are living in a gaps of the machine economy. We use humans to fill the small, difficult spaces where robots still fail. We are the meatware holding the digital world together. And because the work is so repetitive, we have stopped valuing it. We have created a world where the most essential labor, the labor that brings us our food, our clothes, and our tools, is the labor we want to see the least. But as we look at these workers, we are looking into a mirror. We are all part of the repeat loop now. Whether we are the ones picking the box or the ones clicking the screen, we have become addicted to the speed that only extreme monotony can provide. The most repetitive work in history didn't just happen to them, the poor, the desperate, the workers of the past. It happened to us. It reshaped our patience, our empathy, and our very sense of time. The story of human labor began with a hunter chasing a deer across a wild savanna, a life of infinite variety and danger. It has led us here, to a fluorescent-lit aisle, waiting for a beep, repeating a motion until the lights go out. We have traded the wild for the predictable, and the soul for the schedule. The history of the loop is the history of how we paved over the human spirit to build a faster road to now. We have reached the end of the line.
the final station in a 200-year journey that took us from the soot-stained looms of Manchester to the silent, sterile data centers of the modern age. We have seen how the human gear was forged, refined, digitized, and finally algorithmically perfected. But as the dust settles on this history of monotony, we are left with a final haunting question. What was the point of it all? For centuries, we were told that the great monotony was a necessary sacrifice. We traded the variety of the artisan's life for the abundance of the industrial world. We accepted the crushing boredom of the assembly line because it promised us a future where no one would have to go hungry or cold. We gave up our days to the stopwatch so that our children could have a tomorrow filled with leisure. But as we stand in that tomorrow, we realized the promise was a half-truth. The machines didn't just take the work, they took the pace. In this final era, we are witnessing the great decoupling. This is the moment where the human spirit finally realizes it cannot win a race against a processor. After 2 centuries of trying to be faster, more efficient, and more repetitive, we are hitting a wall of collective burnout. We are seeing a global quiet quitting of the soul. People are looking at the endless loops of their digital and physical tasks and asking, is this it? The history of the most repetitive work in human history is ultimately a story of a long detour. We spent 200 years trying to turn humans into robots, only to finally build robots that could do the job better. We are now being forced back to the very beginning. We are being pushed out of the loop and back into the realm of the unpredictable, the creative, and the deeply human. But there is a catch. To leave the loop, we have to break our addiction to the results of the loop. We have to accept that a world without extreme monotony is a world that moves slower. It is a world where things cost more because they were made by a person who had the time to breathe. It is a world where we value the glitch, the unique, non-repetitive thumbprint of a human creator over the sterile perfection of a mass-produced life. As you close this story, look at your surroundings. Almost everything you see, the chair you sit in, the clothes on your back, the device in your hand, is a product of the great monotony. It is a monument to millions of hours of bored, repetitive labor. We owe a debt of gratitude to the human gears who built our civilization one identical motion at a time. But the best way to honor them is to ensure that we are the last generation to be defined by the machine. The era of the human gear is ending. The gear is grinding to a halt, and for the first time in a long time, there is silence. In that silence, we have a choice. We can find a new loop, or we can finally learn to walk again in our own rhythm. The history of repetition is over. The history of what comes next is up to you.
Just when we thought the loop had reached its limit, we entered the era of biometric monotony. In the previous chapters, the repetition was forced upon our hands, our eyes, and our clicking fingers. But in this final, chilling stage of the great monotony, the machine has moved inside our very biology. This is the story of the modern cognitive assembly line, where even our thoughts are being harvested for their repetitive patterns. In high-tech call centers and software hubs across the globe, a new kind of time and motion study is taking place. It's no longer just about how many calls you take or how many lines of code you write. It's about your sentiment score. Workers are now monitored by AI that analyzes the tone of their voice, the speed of their typing, and even the micro-expressions on their faces through webcams. If a worker's positivity dips during the 1,000th repetitive customer complaint, the system flags them for emotional deviance. This is the ultimate evolution of repetition, the repetition of emotion. Imagine being required to maintain the exact same level of synthetic enthusiasm every 30 seconds for 9 hours a day. It is a performance that never ends. You are no longer just a gear. You are a biological interface. Psychologists have begun to identify a new trauma called emotional labor burnout,
where the brain's ability to feel genuine joy or sadness is physically blunted because the fake version has been repeated so many times it has worn a groove in the neural pathways. This level of monitoring creates a panopticon of the mind. In the old factories, you could hate the boss in your head as long as your hands kept moving. Today, the boss is an algorithm that measures your stress levels via your pulse on a wearable device. If you feel the frustration of the monotony, the machine knows. The repetition has become a totalizing force. You must act like a machine, but you must also pretend to be a happy human while doing it. We are seeing the rise of the ghost workers in the AI feedback loop. These are people whose entire existence is to humanize the machine. They spend their days correcting the same 5 types of errors in AI-generated text or images. It is a recursive loop, humans repeating tasks to teach machines how to replace humans, while the machines monitor the humans to make sure they are repeating the tasks efficiently. It is a snake eating its own tail. But why does this matter to the viewer at home? Because the surveillance of the soul is leaking into our personal lives. The same algorithms that track a worker's efficiency are the ones that track your watch time and engagement. We are being trained to be repetitive consumers. We click the same types of videos, we leave the same types of comments, and we follow the same trends. We have become the unpaid laborers in a global factory of attention. The great monotony has achieved its final form. It is no longer a job you go to, it is a world you inhabit. We are the first generation to live in a closed-loop civilization, where our work, our entertainment, and our emotions are all processed through the same repetitive filters. The wall between the factory and the home has finally collapsed. We are always on the clock, and the clock is always watching.
The pressure has finally reached the bursting point. Across the globe, a silent, powerful countercurrent is forming. For the first time since the Luddites smashed steam looms with sledgehammers in the 1800s, humanity is pushing back against the great monotony. But this isn't a rebellion of fire and steel, it is a rebellion of intentionality. It is the story of the Great Resistance, a movement of people who are systematically sabotaging the loops of repetition to reclaim their biological right to be unpredictable. In the high-tech hubs of Silicon Valley and the grueling warehouses of the logistics giants, workers are engaging in algorithmic resistance. They have learned how the software tracks them, and they are finding ways to glitch the system. Delivery drivers are banding together to manipulate the GPS loops, forcing the AI to give them longer break times. Data entry clerks are using phantom scripts to simulate activity while they stare out the window at the sky. These aren't just acts of laziness, they are acts of survival. They are desperate attempts to carve out a few seconds of human time inside a day measured in milliseconds. But the resistance goes deeper than the workplace. We are seeing a massive digital exodus. Millions of people are choosing to unplug, not because they hate technology, but because they hate what technology has done to their sense of time. They are reclaiming the analog rhythm. There is a reason why vinyl records, film photography, and handwritten journals are exploding in popularity. In a world where you can stream 1 million songs with a single repetitive swipe, the act of physically placing a needle on a record is a radical choice. It is a slow, non-repetitive ritual that demands presence. This resistance is creating a new class of human-first communities. These are monotony-free zones where the goal isn't efficiency, but friction. In the industrial age, friction was the enemy. It slowed down the gears. Today, friction is our savior. We need the friction of a long conversation, the friction of a difficult hobby, and the friction of a walk without a destination. We are realizing that efficiency is just another word for oblivion. If you do everything perfectly and quickly, you haven't lived. You've just completed a sequence. The most powerful form of resistance, however, is the reclamation of attention.
People are training themselves to break the scroll loop. They are rediscovering deep work, the ability to focus on one complex, shifting task for hours. This is the ultimate anti-gear behavior. A machine can repeat a simple task forever, but it cannot dwell on a single beautiful problem. By choosing to do one thing deeply rather than 1,000 things repetitively, we are asserting our dominance over the algorithm. As we look at the history of the most repetitive work in history, we see it always ends the same way. The human spirit eventually refuses to be apart. We are not designed for the circle, we are designed for the horizon. The great monotony tried to bend our lives into a loop, but the loop is finally snapping. We are moving from an age of throughput to an age of presence. The story of the most repetitive work in history is a tragedy with a hopeful ending. It shows us that while you can chain a body and you can distract a mind, you can never truly automate the soul. The resistance is happening every time you choose a difficult path over a convenient one. Every time you stop the loop and look up, the machine loses. The history of the gear is over. The history of the human has begun again.
As we stand at the end of this long, rhythmic history, we must confront a final, unsettling truth. The great monotony did not just stay in the factories or the offices. It changed us at a biological level. Scientists are beginning to discover that the stress of extreme repetitive labor can leave epigenetic marks on our DNA. We are, in a very real sense, the children of the loop. For nearly 10 generations, the majority of the human population has been selected for their ability to endure boredom. In the 1700s, a person who couldn't sit still or follow a repetitive pattern was an outcast. By the 1900s, they were unemployable. We have spent 2 centuries breeding the restlessness out of our species to make us better servants of the machine. The ADHD and attention deficits we see today might not be malfunctions at all. They might be the human spirit's desperate evolutionary attempt to reclaim the chaos and variety we were born for. This is the genetic ghost. Even when we are free, we feel the phantom pull of the cycle. It's why we feel guilty when we aren't being productive. It's why we check our phones even when we know there's nothing there. We have been conditioned to believe that a life without a repetitive output is a life without value. We have internalized the factory whistle. But there is a silver lining to this biological realization. If we were programmed to be repetitive, we can be deprogrammed. We're living in the era of the great unlearning. Across the world, from the shying away movement in China to the great resignation in the West, people are realizing that productivity was a scam sold to us by the steam engine. We are rediscovering that the most valuable things a human can do, loving, creating, mourning, and wondering, are the least efficient things in existence. If you look at the trajectory of human history, the repetitive era is just a tiny 200-year blip in a 300,000-year story. We were hunters, artists, and storytellers for 99% of our existence. We were only gears for a fraction of a second in the grand timeline of the universe. The great monotony was an anomaly, a strange fever dream we are finally waking up from. As you finish this journey, realize that your life is not a series of tasks to be optimized. You are not a data point for an algorithm to analyze. You are the descendants of people who survived the most soul-crushing work in history, so that you could finally be the one to stop. The most productive thing you can do today is something that a machine would find completely useless. Sit in the sun, talk to a stranger, or get lost in a thought that has no destination. The gear has finally stopped turning. The loop is broken. The air is clear.
For the first time in 2 centuries, the world is quiet enough for you to hear your own heart beating. And it's not beating in time with a clock, it's beating in time with you.
The loop has been broken, but the landscape it left behind is a haunting one. To truly understand the most repetitive work in human history, we have to look at the monuments we built to house it. This is the story of the architecture of the void, the physical and digital spaces designed to turn human presence into a ghost. In the middle of the 20th century, we created the cubicle farm. It was heralded as a masterpiece of efficiency, but in reality, it was a sensory deprivation chamber. For 40 years, millions of people spent their entire adult lives in a 6 by 6 foot fabric-walled box. The lighting was always the same, the temperature never changed, the view was always a beige wall. This was environment repetition. It was a way to ensure that the mind had nowhere to go but back to the task. When the environment is a loop, the thoughts become a loop. Architects call this non-place design. Whether it's an airport terminal, a fulfillment center, or a cubicle farm, these are spaces where the human being is meant to be in transit, never truly arriving, always moving a part or a pixel. This design philosophy has now migrated into our digital interfaces. Look at the infinite scroll. It is an architectural choice made by designers to ensure that you never hit a footer, a bottom to the page. It is a digital hallway that never ends, designed to keep you in a state of perpetual, repetitive motion. But as we peel back the layers of this history, we find a terrifying phenomenon known as the hollow peak. This occurs when a civilization becomes so efficient at repetition that it begins to produce things for which there is no human need. We see this today in the content mills. There are thousands of people whose job is to write repetitive, SEO-optimized articles that no human will ever read, purely so that an algorithm can rank a website higher. It is a loop of machines writing for machines, with humans acting as the weary translators in the middle. This is the ultimate exhaustion of the industrial dream. We didn't just automate the work, we automated the why. We are now performing repetitive tasks to feed a system that produces ghost products for a ghost audience. The repetition has become untethered from reality. In the 1800s, the repetition produced a shirt. In the 1900s, it produced a car. In the 2020s, it often produces nothing but data, a digital shadow that exists only to justify more repetition. As we conclude this deep dive into the most repetitive work in history, we realize that the work was never the problem. Humans have always worked hard. The tragedy was the disconnection. We allowed ourselves to be separated from the fruit of our labor, the rhythm of our bodies, and the company of our peers. We traded the great variety for a great safety that turned out to be a cage. But every cage has a door. The history of the loop teaches us that no system of monotony is permanent. The machines are taking over the repetition, not to replace us, but to release us, if we have the courage to be released. The final act of the most repetitive work in history isn't a funeral for the human worker, it's a birth. It's the moment we realize that we were never meant to be gears. We were always the ones who built the clock, and we are the only ones who can decide when it's time to stop.
As the dust settles on the era of the great monotony, we are left to wander through the ruins of what we once called the workplace. Throughout the 20th century, we built cathedrals of repetition, massive, windowless structures designed to house the human-machine hybrid. But today, many of those cathedrals stand silent. This is the era of the great abandonment,
where the loop finally outran the human, leaving us to contemplate the hollow shells of our former lives. In cities like Detroit, Sheffield, and Dongguan, there are miles of concrete floors where millions of people once performed the exact same motion for decades. If you stand in those empty halls today, you can almost hear the muscle memory of the past. It is a haunting thought. What happens to all that spent energy? The billions of hours spent tightening a single bolt or punching a single card didn't just vanish. They are baked into the rust in the rebar. They are the sunk cost of our civilization. This leads us to a psychological phenomenon known as the repetition hangover. Even as the work moves to robots and AI, the human workers left behind find themselves unable to adjust to a world that doesn't demand their mechanical obedience. They suffer from a strange nostalgia for the very loop that crushed them. Why? Because the loop provided something the modern, chaotic world does not: certainty. In the factory, you knew exactly what success looked like. It looked like the next part. It looked like the end of the shift. Now we have entered the age of ambiguity. Without the repetitive task to anchor us, many people feel a profound sense of vertical boredom, a deep existential weight that comes from having too many choices and no clear rhythm. We have spent so long being told what to do every 5 seconds that we have lost the ability to structure our own time. We are like prisoners who have been released after 40 years, only to find that the freedom of the outside world is more terrifying than the walls of the cell. But here is where the story takes its most important turn. As the repetitive work disappears, we are seeing the rise of the new craftsmanship. In the gaps left by the machines, people are starting to work with their hands again, not because they have to, but because they need to. They are making bread that takes 3 days to rise. They are knitting sweaters that take a month to finish. They are engaging in productive repetition, the kind of work that heals the mind instead of breaking it. This is the ultimate revenge of the human spirit. We are taking the very concept of repetition and reclaiming it as a tool for meditation and mastery. We are moving from quantity back to quality. The history of the most repetitive work in human history isn't a straight line toward a cliff. It's a circle that is finally returning to its starting point. We are becoming the artists we were before the steam engine arrived to save us. The story of the loop ends not with a bang, but with a breath. It ends with a person sitting at a desk, putting down their phone, ignoring the notification, and choosing to do something slow, something difficult, and something completely unique. The great monotony was a trial by fire, and we have come out the other side with a newfound appreciation for the one thing no machine can ever possess: the beauty of being slow. The factory is empty, the screen is dark, and the clock has stopped. The loop is finally over. Now, for the first time in history, the world is waiting for you to decide what happens next.
We have looked back at the smoke of the 1800s and the glowing screens of today, but there is one final destination we must visit to truly understand the most repetitive work in history. It is the destination we are approaching right now, the singularity of boredom. This is the moment where the work becomes so repetitive, so minute, and so detached from reality that the human brain can no longer recognize it as work at all. It becomes a glitch in the consciousness of our species. In the final stages of the digital era, we have created something called recursive labor. This is the work of people who spend their lives watching machines watch humans. In massive moderation farms, workers are no longer just looking for prohibited content. They are labeling the intent behind a pixel. They are asked to decide 10,000 times a day if a specific facial twitch in a video represents irony or sincerity. They are trying to map the human soul into a binary code so that an AI can eventually mimic it.
This is the most repetitive work in history because it is the repetition of nuance. We are taking the most complex, beautiful parts of our humanity, our humor, our sarcasm, our grief, and we are grinding them down into repetitive data points. The worker is forced to stay in a state of hyper-focus on things that don't matter for a purpose they will never see realized. It is the ultimate form of alienation. But as this work reaches its peak, something strange is happening. The humans trapped in these loops are starting to experience the temporal slip. When you repeat a microtask every 3 seconds for years, your perception of time begins to shatter. Workers report that minutes feel like hours, while years vanish in a blink. They lose the ability to sequence their own memories. Their lives become a flat present, where there is no past to learn from and no future to look forward to, only the eternal, repetitive now of the task. This is the final warning of the great monotony. If we allow our lives to be reduced to a series of identical pulses, we lose our story. A human life is meant to be a narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end, filled with peaks and valleys. Repetitive work flattens that narrative into a straight line, and as any doctor will tell you, a straight line on a monitor means the heart has stopped. But here is the final secret. The loop only has power as long as you stay inside it. Every historical era of monotony ended because someone, somewhere, decided that their time was worth more than the wage they were being paid to waste it. The factory system didn't end because it was inefficient. It ended because humans became too expensive for the machine, not in terms of money, but in terms of spirit. As you finish this story, look at the loops in your own life. How much of your day is spent in recursive labor, scrolling, checking, reacting, repeating? We are all in some way still working on that invisible assembly line. But the exit is right there. It has always been there. It's called the unproductive moment. It's the moment you do something that cannot be measured, cannot be sold, and cannot be repeated. The history of the most repetitive work is a mirror held up to our faces. It asks us, are you a gear, or are you the hand that turns the key? The machine is silent. The line has stopped. The choice, finally, is yours.
We have reached the edge of the map. Beyond this point, history hasn't been written yet. It is being coded. To understand the absolute final frontier of the most repetitive work ever known, we have to look at the ghost in the machine. This is the stage where the repetition is so profound that the human worker becomes invisible even to themselves. This is the world of human in the loop, or HIT, AI training. In high-tech hubs and remote digital villages alike, there are millions of people whose entire career is simply being more human than the computer. They are the correctionists. Every time a sophisticated AI generates a sentence that is slightly off, or an image of a hand with 6 fingers, a human must intervene. Their job? Click the wrong button, over and over, 10 hours a day. They are the quality control for a mind that isn't their own. This is the repetition of the correction. In the 1800s, you made a shoe. In the 2020s, you make a prediction. These workers are repeating the same decision-making process millions of times to sharpen the intuition of a silicon chip. But here is the tragedy. The more successful they are at their repetitive task, the faster they destroy their own livelihood. They are the only workers in history whose primary job is to train their replacement to perfection. It is a race to a finish line where the prize is your own obsolescence. The psychological toll has created a new condition called digital dysphoria.